The whispers started the day Penelope Carter turned 26. And by the time she reached 28, the good people of Grass Valley, California, had all but written her obituary as a spinster destined to wither away alone in that cramped boarding house room overlooking Main Street. It was September of 1872, and Penelope stood at the window of Mrs. Henderson's establishment, watching the golden afternoon light paint the Sierra Nevada foothills in shades of amber and rust. The summer had been long and dusty, filled with the sounds of miners trudging through town, with their dreams of gold still clinging to their boots, despite the best days of the rush being well behind them. Now autumn approached with its promise of cooler temperatures and changing leaves, though Penelope wondered if anything in her own life would ever truly change. Still mooning about up there, Penelope, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried up the narrow staircase with that particular mix of pity and exasperation that had become all too familiar. There's mending needs doing, and those sheets will not wash themselves. Penelope turned from the window, smoothing her simple cotton dress over her hips. She was not a beautiful woman by the standards that seemed to matter in small towns like this. Her features were pleasant enough, her brown hair thick and wavy when she bothered to let it down, her eyes a clear hazel that caught the light in interesting ways. But she was too tall, too forthright in her opinions, too educated for her own good according to the matrons who gathered at the general store to discuss the failings of the younger generation. "Coming, Mrs. Henderson," she called, gathering the sewing basket from beside her narrow bed. The room was spare but clean, containing little more than the bed, a washstand, a trunk with her few possessions, and the window that had become her primary source of entertainment over the past 3 years since she had come to Grass Valley seeking work as a schoolteacher, only to find the position had been filled by the mayor's niece 2 days before her arrival. She descended the stairs to find Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her generous forearms as she kneaded bread dough with the vigor of a woman half her age. The older woman glanced up, her expression softening slightly at the sight of Penelope's resigned face. "Did not mean to snap at you, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, though her tone remained brisk. "But I had Martha Simmons in here this morning, going on about how her daughter just got engaged to that banker's clerk from Sacramento. Fourth daughter married off, and Martha cannot help but mention it every chance she gets." She paused in her kneading, fixing Penelope with a measuring look. "You know what she said about you." Penelope set the sewing basket on the kitchen table, already knowing she did not want to hear this but unable to stop the inevitable. "I can imagine." She said it was a shame, a real shame, that a girl with your advantages, and by that she means the fact that your father sent you to that school in San Francisco, should end up an old maid with no prospects. Said you would likely die alone, forgotten, with no children to tend your grave. The words struck harder than they should have, perhaps because Penelope had been thinking similar thoughts herself lately. She was 28 years old, living in a boarding house, taking in mending and washing to pay for her room and board, with no family nearby and no particular future to look forward to. Her parents had died of fever when she was 23. Her only brother had gone east to pursue a career in law and rarely wrote, and the education her father had scrimped and saved to provide her had proven to be more of a hindrance than a help in finding either employment or a husband. "Well," Penelope said, lifting her chin in that way that had put off more than one potential suitor over the years, "I suppose Martha Simmons is entitled to her opinion, however uncharitable it might be." Mrs. Henderson snorted, returning to her dough. "Martha Simmons is a gossip and a busybody, but she is not entirely wrong. You need to think about your future, Penelope. You are still young enough to catch a man's eye if you tried. There's that Mr. Peterson who runs the livery. He has been a widower for 2 years now and needs a mother for those 3 children of his. Mr. Peterson is 57 years old and smells perpetually of horse manure, Penelope said flatly. And his children are all older than I am. You are too particular. That is your problem. Always have been. A woman in your position cannot afford to be choosy. Penelope picked up the first item from the mending basket, a work shirt with a torn sleeve that belonged to one of the miners who boarded 2 doors down. She threaded her needle with sharp, precise movements, channeling her frustration into the familiar task. I would rather die an old maid alone than marry a man I cannot respect or feel anything for beyond duty. Romantic nonsense, Mrs. Henderson declared, but there was a hint of sadness in her voice. Love is a luxury for the young and the wealthy, dear girl. The rest of us make do with what we can get. The conversation died there, and Penelope spent the rest of the afternoon mending and washing, her hands busy while her mind wandered to that same old question. Was this truly all her life would amount to? The seasons would change. Autumn would give way to winter and winter to spring, and she would still be here, growing older and more invisible with each passing year, until one day she would simply cease to exist except as a cautionary tale for young girls who dared to want more than what fate seemed determined to give them. That evening, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains and the air took on the first real chill of approaching autumn, Penelope walked to the general store to purchase thread and a few other necessities. The boardwalks were busy with the usual evening traffic. Miners heading to the saloons, families finishing their shopping, the stagecoach rumbling past in a cloud of dust. She nodded politely to those who acknowledged her, felt the weight of pitying glances from the married women, and tried to ignore the way younger girls whispered and giggled as she passed, as if spinsterhood were some contagious disease they might catch from proximity. She was just leaving the general store, her purchases tucked into her market basket, when a commotion near the edge of town caught her attention. A crowd had gathered around someone or something, and the buzz of excited conversation carried on the evening air. Curious despite herself, Penelope moved closer, standing on her toes to see over the shoulders of the men blocking her view. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A man stood in the center of the crowd, and he was unlike anyone she had ever seen in Grass Valley. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the fading sunlight. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back loosely with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered and tanned from years of exposure to the elements. He wore buckskin pants and a shirt that strained across a chest and arms corded with heavy muscle, and at his hip hung a knife in a beaded sheath that spoke of time spent among the native peoples of the mountains. His boots were worn but well made, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no bluster or bravado. He was, Penelope thought with a strange flutter in her chest, the most magnificent man she had ever laid eyes on. "That is Marcus Hayes," someone near her whispered. "The mountain man. Lives up in the high country, only comes down a few times a year for supplies. Heard he killed a grizzly bear with just his knife," another voice added. "Tracked it for 3 days after it attacked his camp. My cousin said he lived with the Washoe tribe for a spell, learned their ways. They call him Brother Who Walks Alone." Penelope found herself unable to look away as Marcus Hayes concluded his business with the crowd. Apparently, he had brought furs and fresh meat to trade, and began loading his pack mule with the supplies he had acquired in exchange. His movements were efficient and economical, no wasted motion. the actions of a man accustomed to relying solely on himself in an unforgiving environment. Then, as if feeling her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met across the dusty street. The world seemed to slow and still. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they held an intelligence and depth that surprised her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Penelope felt something shift inside her chest, some locked door swinging open to possibilities she had long since stopped allowing herself to imagine. Marcus Hayes nodded once, a brief acknowledgement, and then returned to his work. The spell broken, Penelope realized she had been holding her breath. She forced herself to turn away, to walk back toward the boarding house with her heart beating faster than it had in years, though she could not have said exactly why. That night she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, and thought about storm cloud eyes, and a man who chose the solitude of the mountains over the company of civilization. She wondered what kind of loneliness drove a person to such isolation, and whether it was really so different from her own. The next morning brought crisp air and clear skies, the kind of September day that made the California foothills feel like paradise. Penelope rose early, as was her habit, and after completing her morning chores at the boarding house, she decided to walk to the edge of town where a small creek provided a pleasant spot for reflection and occasional solitude. She was sitting on a sun-warmed rock, her skirts tucked around her legs and a book open on her lap, when the sound of footsteps made her look up. Her heart gave an unexpected leap as she recognized the tall figure approaching along the creek bank. Marcus Hayes walked with the easy, ground-covering stride of a man used to traveling long distances on foot. He carried a fishing pole fashioned from a sapling and line, and he seemed surprised to see her there, though his expression remained calm and unreadable. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Did not mean to disturb you. Usually no one comes out this way so early." Penelope found her voice, though it came out slightly breathless. "Good morning. I often come here to read. It is peaceful." He nodded, glancing at the book in her lap. "Shakespeare," he observed, and she realized he could read the title from where he stood. "The Tempest. Good choice." Her surprise must have shown on her face because something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Most folks assume a mountain man cannot read," he said. "But my mother was a school teacher back in Missouri, made sure I had an education before I headed west." "I apologize if I appeared rude," Penelope said quickly. "I am simply not accustomed to meeting people who recognize Shakespeare on sight. Even in town, most people think reading anything beyond the Bible or the newspaper is a waste of time. Then most people are fools." He said it matter-of-factly, without heat or judgment. "Mind if I fish here? This spot usually has good trout this time of morning." "Of course not." "Please, go ahead." She tried to return to her book, but found herself watching him instead as he baited his hook with practiced ease and cast his line into a deep pool where the creek eddied around a fallen log. He settled onto a rock a few yards downstream from her, and for a while they remained in companionable silence, the only sounds the burble of water over stones and the occasional call of birds in the cottonwoods. "You are the woman from the boarding house," Marcus said after a time, not looking at her but keeping his eyes on the water. "Penelope Carter, I asked about you last night at the general store." Her heart did that strange flutter again. "You asked about me? Why?" Now he did look at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel suddenly warm despite the cool morning air. "Because when our eyes met yesterday, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time. Wanted to know if you were married or spoken for." The directness of it stole her breath. In her limited experience with men, There had always been dancing around the subject, subtle hints and social games that exhausted her. This blunt honesty was both startling and refreshing. "I am neither," she managed to say. "I am, as the good people of Grass Valley like to remind me, an old maid with no prospects." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Old maid, you cannot be more than 25 or 26. 28. And in a town like this, that might as well be 50. Then the men of this town are even bigger fools than I thought." He paused, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly as if he were working up the courage to say something difficult. "I am 32 years old, Miss Carter. Been living in the mountains for near about 8 years now, ever since my wife and son died of the cholera during the crossing to California. Told myself I was done with people, with towns, with all of it. Just me and the mountains and the sky." The revelation of his loss made her chest ache with sympathy. "I am so sorry. That must have been devastating." It was. Still is, some days. But a man cannot grieve forever, and lately I have been thinking that maybe living alone until I die is not the noble choice I convinced myself it was. Maybe it is just another kind of giving up. He reeled in his line, examined the bait, cast again. "When I saw you yesterday, something in your eyes looked familiar. Same kind of loneliness I see in my own reflection when I bother to look in a mirror." Penelope set her book aside, giving him her full attention. "You saw all that in one glance." "I did. Question is, was I right?" She could have deflected, could have retreated behind the polite social masks that everyone wore in town. But something about this man and this moment seemed to call for the same honesty he had offered her. "Yes," she said quietly, "you were right. I have been lonely for longer than I care to admit. My parents died 5 years ago, my brother went east and we have grown apart, and I came here thinking I would teach school, but that position was already filled. Now, I take in mending and washing to pay for my room and help Mrs. Henderson with the boarding house, and the town has decided I am to be pitied and forgotten in equal measure." "But you have not forgotten yourself," Marcus said, and it was not a question. "You still read Shakespeare by the creek. You still have fire in your eyes. That is worth something." "Is it? Some days I wonder if I should just accept one of the few offers that come my way. Marry Mr. Peterson, the livery owner, and resign myself to a life of duty and quiet desperation." "Do not." The word came out sharp, almost fierce. "Do not settle for half a life just because people tell you that is all you deserve. And what would you suggest instead?" The question came out more challenging than she intended, years of frustration bleeding through. "Should I just keep waiting, keep hoping, until I truly am too old and it really is too late?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the water. Then he set down his fishing pole and turned to face her fully, and the expression on his face made her pulse quicken. "I came down from the mountains 2 days early this trip," he said. "Told myself it was because I needed supplies before the weather turned. But the truth is, I have been thinking about coming back to the world, about finding someone to share my life with. Spent the whole summer arguing with myself about it, and I had just about decided I was being a fool. Then I saw you yesterday, and something just knew." "Knew what?" Penelope whispered. "That you were what I had been looking for without even realizing I was looking." He stood, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I know this sounds crazy. I know we just met. But I am not a man who plays games or has time for long courtships. Winter comes early in the high country, and I need to be back up the mountain before the snows start. So I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think real hard before you answer." Penelope rose to her feet, her book forgotten. "Ask me what? Come with me. Up into the mountains. I have a good cabin, tight and warm, with plenty of supplies laid in. I can hunt and fish and trap enough to keep us fed and provide furs to trade. It is not an easy life, and it is isolated, but it is honest and real. And I give you my word I will spend every day trying to make you happy if you will just take a chance on me." The world seemed to spin around her. This could not be happening. Men did not just ask women they barely knew to run off with them into the wilderness. It was mad, reckless, completely improper, and yet every fiber of her being was screaming yes. "You are asking me to marry you," she managed to say. "We have known each other for all of an hour. I am asking you to give us a chance. We can go into town right now and find the preacher, get married proper before we head up the mountain. Or if you need more time, I can wait a few days, give you time to think it over. But I leave before the end of September, before the season changes. That gives us maybe 2 weeks." Penelope pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering against her palm. "This is insane. Maybe, or maybe it is the sanest thing either of us could do. You said yourself you are lonely and wasting away in that boarding house. I have been alone so long I forgot what it felt like to want someone's company. We could keep doing what we are doing, playing it safe, and end up exactly where we are now a year from now, 5 years from now. Or we could take a risk. I do not even know you. Then get to know me. I will be in town for the next week at least, taking care of business and getting my supplies together. Spend time with me. Talk to me. If by the time I am ready to leave you do not think we could make a life together, I will go alone and no hard feelings. But if you feel even a fraction of what I felt when I looked at you yesterday, then give this a chance." Penelope looked at him, really looked at him. Saw the vulnerability beneath the strength, the loneliness that mirrored her own, the genuine hope in those storm cloud eyes. Every practical bone in her body said this was madness. But the part of her that had withered away over years of disappointment and diminished expectations was suddenly roaring back to life, demanding to be heard. "1 week," she heard herself say. "You have 1 week to convince me this is not the worst idea in the history of bad ideas." The smile that broke across Marcus Hayes's face was like sunrise over the mountains, transforming his weathered features into something beautiful. 1 week, he agreed. "That is all I need." Over the next 7 days, Penelope experienced a whirlwind that left her breathless and giddy and terrified in equal measure. True to his word, Marcus courted her with an intensity and focus that made her feel like the most important person in the world. He met her each morning at the creek, and they would walk together through the hills surrounding Grass Valley, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that he had been a farmer's son in Missouri, that he had married his childhood sweetheart at 20, that the journey west had been filled with hope and dreams that died alongside his wife and infant son. She learned that he loved the mountains because they did not judge or pity, that he found peace in the rhythm of the seasons and the company of eagles and elk, that he had indeed lived for a time with the Washoe people and considered several of them dear friends. In turn, she told him about her own losses, about her father who had believed education was as important for daughters as for sons, about her mother who had played piano and taught her to love music, even though they could never afford an instrument of their own. She told him about the crushing disappointment of arriving in Grass Valley to find her teaching position given to someone else, about the slow erosion of hope as months became years, and her savings dwindled away to nothing. "Why did you not just leave?" Marcus asked one afternoon as they sat beside the creek, his fishing line in the water in her hand somehow finding its way into his much larger one. "Go to another town, try to find another position. Pride, I suppose," Penelope admitted. "I had written to my brother about the job, told him I was going to make something of myself. Could not bear to write again and admit I had failed. And then my savings were gone, and I had no way to afford the stage fare to anywhere else. I was trapped by my own stubbornness and circumstances. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. Not trapped anymore. Not if you do not want to be. Each day she found herself more drawn to him, more certain that this mad proposal might actually be the answer she had been seeking without knowing it. He was gentle with her, despite his obvious strength, respectful of her boundaries even as the attraction between them grew stronger. When he kissed her for the first time on the 4th day of their courtship, beneath a cottonwood tree with golden leaves just beginning to fall around them, she felt something click into place inside her heart. This was what she had been waiting for. Not the tepid affection of convenience, not the resignation of settling for whatever came along, but this fierce, consuming feeling that made her want to be brave. The town, of course, had opinions. Mrs. Henderson was scandalized and delighted in equal measure, torn between dire warnings about the impropriety of it all and the romantic notion of one of her boarders being swept off her feet by a mysterious mountain man. The other townspeople ranged from shocked to envious to disapproving, and Penelope found she did not care what any of them thought. For the first time in years, she was living for herself and not for the expectations or judgments of others. On the 6th day, Marcus took her to meet a Washoe elder named Running Deer, who had come down from the mountains to trade at the settlement a few miles east of Grass Valley. The old man looked at Penelope with wise, assessing eyes and spoke to Marcus in a mixture of Washoe and English. "This woman has strong spirit," Running Deer said. "She will need it to live in the high places through the winter. You are sure she understands what you are asking of her?" "I have told her everything," Marcus replied. "The isolation, the hard work, the dangers. She knows." Running Deer turned to Penelope. "And you still wish to go with him?" "I do," Penelope said, meeting the elder's gaze steadily. "I know it will not be easy, but I would rather face hardship with someone who sees me and values me than live in comfort as half a person." The old man smiled, showing gaps where teeth had once been. "You have chosen well, brother who walks alone. She has the heart of the mountain already in her." He pressed a small bundle wrapped in soft leather into Penelope's hands. "A gift. Herbs and medicines you will need in the high country. And wisdom passed from my grandmother to her granddaughter. You are part of the mountain family now." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I will honor your gift and learn all I can." That evening, as the sun set in glorious shades of orange and purple behind the mountains, Marcus and Penelope sat on the porch of the boarding house and talked about the practical realities of what they were planning. "I will not lie to you," Marcus said, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. "The cabin is small, just one room really, though I built it solid and it keeps out the cold. We will be snowed in for weeks at a time come January and February. The nearest other people are the Washoe winter camps, about a day's walk when the weather is clear. If something goes wrong, if you get sick or hurt, we will be on our own to handle it." "I understand," Penelope said, "and I am still choosing this, choosing you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We will need to get married soon. Tomorrow, if you are willing. I want to leave the day after. Give us time to get up the mountain and settled before the weather turns." "Tomorrow," Penelope agreed, her heart racing at how fast this was all happening but certain it was right. "I will be ready." Mrs. Henderson, when informed of the wedding plans, threw herself into preparations with surprising enthusiasm. "Well, if you are going to do this mad thing, you will do it properly," she declared, and spent the evening altering one of her own good dresses to fit Penelope's taller, slimmer frame. Other women from the boarding house contributed what they could. A ribbon for her hair, a borrowed pair of gloves, a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the scent of autumn heavy in the air. Penelope dressed carefully in the borrowed finery, her hands only shaking a little as she pinned up her hair, and tried to see herself as a bride in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman looking back at her had bright eyes and flushed cheeks, and an expression of barely contained joy that seemed to belong to a stranger. The wedding itself was a simple affair, held in the small church at the edge of town with Mrs. Henderson and a handful of boarders as witnesses. Marcus wore clean buckskins and had trimmed his hair slightly, though it still hung past his collar in a way that made the preacher frown slightly. But when Penelope walked up the aisle and saw the expression on Marcus's face, awe and tenderness and fierce possessiveness, all mixed together, she knew she was making the right choice. The vows were traditional, the preacher's voice droning through the familiar words about duty and obedience and faithfulness. But when Marcus slipped a simple silver band on her finger, a ring he had purchased from the general store just that morning, and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, Penelope felt the truth of it resonate in her soul. This was real. This was forever. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Marcus kissed her, slow and sweet and full of promise, Penelope heard Mrs. Henderson sniffle and dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. The small congregation clapped politely, and then it was done. She was Penelope Hayes, wife of a mountain man, and her entire life was about to change. They spent their wedding night in Marcus's room at the other boarding house in town, the one that catered to trappers and mountain men passing through. It was a far cry from fancy, just a narrow bed and a washstand and a window overlooking the stable yard, but Penelope did not care. Marcus was gentle and patient with her, understanding that despite her age, she had no experience with physical intimacy, and he took his time showing her the pleasures that could be found in the marriage bed. When she finally fell asleep in his arms, her body pleasantly sore and her heart full to bursting, she felt more at peace than she had in years. They rose before dawn the next morning, and Marcus helped her pack her few belongings into saddlebags and a small trunk that would be loaded onto the pack mule. She did not have much to bring: her clothes, her books, a few personal items that had belonged to her parents, the sewing basket she used for mending. Everything that truly mattered she was leaving behind. Or rather, she was carrying it with her in the form of the tall, strong man who was now her husband. Mrs. Henderson and a few early risers came out to see them off as the sun broke over the mountains. The older woman embraced Penelope fiercely, whispering in her ear, "You be happy, you hear me? And if he does not treat you right, you come straight back here and I will take my rolling pin to him." Penelope laughed, hugging her back just as hard. "I will be happy. Thank you for everything, truly." Then Marcus was lifting her onto the sturdy mare he had purchased for her, and he swung up onto his own gelding with easy grace. The pack mule, loaded down with supplies for the winter, stood patiently waiting. Marcus looked at Penelope, his eyes questioning one last time, giving her one final chance to change her mind. She smiled at him, brilliant and sure, and nudged her mare forward. "Let us go home," she said. The journey into the mountains took 3 days, and every mile carried them further from civilization and deeper into a world that seemed untouched by human hands. They followed trails that were barely visible, winding through stands of towering pines and across crystal-clear streams that Marcus said were fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The air grew colder and thinner as they climbed, and Penelope found herself grateful for the warm coat Marcus had insisted she purchase before they left town. At night, they camped under the stars, and Marcus taught her how to build a proper fire, how to hang their food so bears would not be tempted to investigate, how to read the signs of changing weather in the clouds and the wind. She proved an apt student, listening carefully and asking questions that clearly pleased him. On the second night, as they lay in their bedrolls beside the fire with the stars wheeling overhead in impossible brightness, Marcus pulled her close and whispered, "You are going to do just fine up here." "I can already tell." "I hope so," Penelope murmured back. "I do not want to disappoint you." "Impossible," he said firmly. "You took a chance on me, on this life. That alone proves you are the bravest woman I have ever known." On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a ridge and Marcus pointed ahead to a small valley nestled between two peaks. "There," he said. "Home." Penelope shaded her eyes and looked where he indicated. She could see a cabin tucked against the side of the mountain, backed by towering pines and facing a meadow that would likely be green and lush in summer, but now showed the gold and brown of approaching winter. A creek ran along one edge of the meadow, glinting in the afternoon sun, and beyond it, the mountains rose in layers of blue and purple and white where snow already clung to the highest peaks. It was, she thought with a strange catch in her throat, the most beautiful place she had ever seen. They rode down into the valley as the sun began its descent, and with each step Penelope felt something settle inside her. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. The cabin was larger than Marcus had suggested. A solid log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Beside it stood a well-built shed for the animals and supplies, and evidence of a large garden plot that had been harvested for the year. Marcus dismounted and came to help her down from her mare, his hands strong and steady on her waist. "What do you think?" he asked, and she could hear the vulnerability in his voice. This place was his sanctuary, his refuge, and he was sharing it with her. Her opinion mattered. "I think it is perfect," Penelope said honestly. "Show me everything." He did, taking obvious pride in showing her around the property he had built with his own hands. The cabin interior was indeed just one large room, but it was cleverly arranged with a sleeping area curtained off for privacy, a cooking area near the massive stone fireplace, a table and chairs for eating, and shelves lined with supplies and tools. The floor was made of smooth planks that fit together tightly, and the windows had real glass in them, a luxury Penelope had not expected. Furs covered the bed and hung on the walls for extra insulation, and the whole place had a clean, well-maintained feeling that spoke of care and attention. "It is wonderful," Penelope said, running her hand over the table that Marcus had clearly hewn himself. "You built all of this over the course of 3 years," he said, "added to it and improved it each summer. The washu helped with some of it, taught me techniques for keeping the cold out that I never would have figured out on my own." Over the next few weeks, they settled into the rhythms of mountain life. Marcus taught Penelope everything she needed to know to survive and eventually thrive in this harsh environment. She learned to shoot the rifle he gave her, to set snares for rabbits and other small game, to recognize which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She learned to preserve food, to smoke meat and dry berries, to make pemmican that would keep through the winter. She learned to read the weather, to know when snow was coming hours before it arrived, to understand the warnings in the behavior of the animals and birds. And through it all, she fell more deeply in love with her husband. Marcus was patient and kind, never making her feel foolish when she made mistakes, always ready with encouragement and praise when she succeeded. He showed her the best fishing spots, took her to a high meadow where elk gathered at dawn, pointed out the nest of a golden eagle in the cliffs above their cabin. He told her stories of his years in the mountains, of encounters with grizzlies and mountain lions, of trading with the Washoe and learning their language and customs, of the brutal winters when he had wondered if he would make it through to spring. "Why do you stay?" Penelope asked him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the peaks. "After everything you have been through, what keeps you here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his arm around her shoulders and his eyes on the fading light. "Peace," he finally said. "The mountains do not ask questions I cannot answer. They do not care about my past or judge my choices. They just are, and I can just be with them. At least that was true before." "Before what?" He looked down at her, his eyes soft in the twilight. "Before you. Now I stay because this is our home, because I want to build a life here with you, because I want to watch the seasons change with you beside me and know that I am not alone anymore." Penelope reached up to cup his cheek, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "You will never be alone again. I promise you that." The first snow came in mid-October, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning of what was to come. Marcus became even more focused on preparations, making sure they had enough firewood stacked and covered, checking and rechecking their supplies, hunting one last time to add to their stores of smoked venison. Penelope helped with everything, her hands growing calloused and strong from the work, her body adapting to the physical demands of this life. She found, to her surprise, that she loved it. Loved the simplicity and honesty of it, the way each day had a purpose and a rhythm. Loved the satisfaction of work well done, of looking at the rows of preserved food they had put up together, and knowing they would not go hungry. Loved the quiet evenings by the fire with Marcus reading aloud from one of her books while she mended or worked on the new buckskin dress she was making with leather and beading techniques taught to her by running Deer's granddaughter before they had left the lower country. But most of all, she loved the intimacy of this life. In town, there had always been people around, always social expectations and masks to maintain. Here it was just the two of them, and she could be entirely herself. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, shared dreams and fears and hopes for the future. At night, they made love with increasing passion and confidence, learning each other's bodies and desires, finding joy and pleasure in the marriage bed that Penelope had never imagined possible. November brought heavier snows, and by December they were truly isolated. The world shrank to just the valley, the cabin, the space they had created together. Some days the snow fell so thick and fast they could barely see the shed from the porch, and Penelope understood why Marcus had been so insistent on having everything ready. But the cabin stayed warm and tight, the supplies held out well, and they were happy in their isolation. It was during one of those deep winter nights, with wind howling around the cabin and snow piling up against the walls, that Penelope realized she had not experienced her monthly courses since, before they had left Grass Valley. She had been so busy, so focused on learning everything she needed to survive, that she had not noticed the absence. Now, counting back, she felt her breath catch as the reality sank in. She was pregnant. She had to be. And while part of her was thrilled at the prospect of having Marcus's child, another part was terrified. They were miles from any doctor or midwife, completely cut off from help until the spring thaws. What if something went wrong? What if she could not do this? Marcus noticed her distraction immediately, as he always did. "What is it?" he asked, setting down the trap he had been mending. "You have that look like your mind is 100 miles away." Penelope took a deep breath, deciding that honesty had served them well so far and there was no reason to stop now. "I think I am with child," she said quietly. "I have not been certain, but all the signs are there." She watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and then a smile broke across his features, transforming them with pure joy. "Truly, you are sure. As sure as I can be without a doctor to confirm it. My courses have stopped, and I have been feeling queasy in the mornings, and certain smells that never bothered me before now make me feel ill. All the things my mother told me to watch for." Marcus crossed the cabin in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "I never thought I would have another child, never thought I deserved another chance after losing Thomas." Penelope felt him tremble and realized he was crying, silent tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. She held him close, letting him feel whatever he needed to feel, understanding that this was about more than just their baby. This was about hope and healing and the possibility of joy after terrible loss. "We are going to be fine," she said firmly. "The baby and I will be fine. I am strong and healthy, and Running Deer gave me herbs and medicines, and I have you, and that is worth more than a dozen doctors." Marcus pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes red but shining with happiness. "I will take care of you, both of you. I swear it on my life. I know you will. And I will do my part too. We are in this together, remember." As winter deepened and Penelope's pregnancy progressed, Marcus became even more attentive and protective than before. He took over the heavier chores, insisted she rest more, brought her the choicest bits of meat, and made sure she ate well. He talked to the baby every night, his big hands spread across her growing belly, telling their child about the mountains and the animals and how much they were already loved. Running Deer and his family visited once in late January, making the difficult journey through the snow to check on them and bring gifts for the baby. A cradle board beautifully crafted and decorated, soft rabbit fur blankets, more herbs and medicines. Running Deer's granddaughter, a woman named Morning Light who had given birth to 3 children of her own, spent hours with Penelope teaching her what to expect and how to prepare. "The pain will be intense," Morning Light said bluntly. "But you are strong. I can see it in you. Listen to your body, let it do what it knows how to do, and you will bring this baby into the world safely." "And if something goes wrong?" Penelope asked quietly, voicing the fear she had not wanted to say aloud to Marcus. Morning Light met her eyes steadily. "Then your man will do everything in his power to save you both, and I have left medicines and instructions for the things that sometimes happen. But worrying about what might go wrong will not help. Focus on what is right. You are healthy, the baby is growing well, you have a warm home and a man who loves you. These are the things that matter." After the Washoe family departed, Penelope felt more settled. She spent the long winter days preparing, sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric Marcus had purchased in Grass Valley, organizing the birthing supplies, and talking to the baby that grew larger inside her with each passing week. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow began to melt in earnest in late March, and by early April the meadow was coming back to life with new grass and wildflowers. Penelope, now heavily pregnant and moving with the careful waddle of a woman in her final weeks, spent as much time as she could outside, soaking up the sunshine and fresh air. Marcus was planting the garden when her pain started, a warm afternoon in late April with clouds building over the peaks. She had been sitting on the porch snapping fresh peas when the first contraction hit, stealing her breath with its intensity. She waited, counting, and when another came 20 minutes later she called out to Marcus. He dropped his hoe and ran to her, his face going pale beneath his tan. "Is it time?" "I think so," Penelope said, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "The pains are still far apart, but Morning Light said to rest once they started." Marcus helped her inside and settled her on the bed they had prepared for this moment, layers of clean cloth spread over the furs. He checked the supplies they had laid out weeks ago, made sure water was heating over the fire, and then came to sit beside her, taking her hand. "I am scared," Penelope admitted, squeezing his fingers hard as another contraction built and crested. "What if I cannot do this?" "You can and you will," Marcus said firmly. "You are the bravest, strongest woman I know. You left everything you knew to come up here with me. You learned to survive in the mountains in a matter of months. You can do this too." The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon and into the evening. Marcus never left her side except to fetch water or check the fire, his presence a constant source of comfort, even when the pain became so intense Penelope thought she might break from it. He wiped her face with cool cloths, massaged her back when the contractions made her feel like her spine would snap, whispered encouragement and love in her ear during the worst moments. Night fell and still the baby did not come. Penelope grew exhausted, the contractions coming hard and fast now. Her body slicked with sweat despite the cool mountain air. She could see the worry in Marcus's eyes, but he kept his voice steady, kept reminding her to breathe, to push when her body told her to push, to rest between the waves of pain. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky outside their window pink and gold, she felt something shift and change inside her. The urge to push became overwhelming and she bore down with all her remaining strength, clutching Marcus's hand so hard she felt his bones grind together. He did not complain, just kept urging her on, telling her she was almost there, almost done. With a final push that tore a scream from her throat, Penelope felt the baby slide free. Marcus was there to catch their child, and through the haze of exhaustion and relief, Penelope heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A baby's first cry, thin and outraged and utterly perfect. "It is a boy," Marcus said, his voice thick with tears. "We have a son, Penelope. A healthy son." He cleaned the baby quickly with the warm water and cloths they had prepared, then wrapped him in soft blankets and placed him on Penelope's chest. She looked down at the tiny red face, the dark hair plastered to the small skull, the miniature fists waving in the air, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it nearly hurt. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Marcus knelt beside the bed, his arms around both of them, and Penelope saw tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Thank you for this gift, for giving me a family again." They named him William, after Penelope's father, with the middle name Thomas to honor Marcus's first son. Little William was a healthy baby, with a good appetite and strong lungs that he used frequently in those early weeks. Penelope recovered well from the birth, aided by the medicines running deer had left and by Marcus's devoted care. He took over everything else so she could focus on healing and feeding the baby, and she fell even more in love with him watching him interact with their son. Marcus was gentle and patient with the tiny infant, changing soiled cloths without complaint, walking the floor with William when he fussed, singing soft songs in the Washoe language that he had learned from his friends in the tribe. He crafted a smaller cradle board than the one they had been gifted, sized perfectly for a newborn, and Penelope would often find him in the evenings with William strapped to his chest in the traditional way, talking to the baby about the mountains and the animals as if the infant could understand every word. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Marcus confessed one night as they lay in bed with William sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. "After losing Emily and Thomas, I thought that part of my life was over, that I did not deserve another chance." Penelope rolled to face him, her hand reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "You deserve all the happiness in the world. You are a good man, Marcus Hayes, the best man I have ever known. I am the lucky one, he insisted. You could have stayed in Grass Valley, eventually found someone more civilized, had an easier life. Instead, you took a chance on a mountain man who had nothing to offer but a hard life in the wilderness. You offered me everything that mattered, Penelope corrected. Love and respect and a partnership of equals. You saw me, really saw me, when everyone else just saw a spinster to pity. And you gave me this beautiful life, this beautiful family. I would not trade it for all the civilization and ease in the world. Summer that year was glorious, and they fell into new rhythms with a baby in the household. Penelope wore William in a sling as she worked in the garden or preserved food for the coming winter, and Marcus took him along on short hunting trips, the baby sleeping peacefully against his father's broad chest. Running Deer and his family visited several times, delighted with the new addition and offering advice and gifts. Morning Light pronounced William healthy and strong, and praised Penelope for adapting so well to motherhood. As autumn approached again, marking a full year since Penelope had arrived in Grass Valley and met Marcus, they talked about making a trip down to town to show off their son and replenish supplies. But in the end, they decided against it. Their life was here in the mountains, and they had everything they needed. Word of their happiness would reach Grass Valley through the trading networks eventually, and perhaps someday they would visit. But for now, this was enough, more than enough. Years passed in a pattern of seasons, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Winter mornings with the cabin warm and secure while snow piled high outside. Spring with the meadow bursting into life and William toddling after his father as Marcus planted the garden. Summer days spent fishing in the creek and teaching William to recognize animal tracks. Autumn harvests and preparations for the cold months ahead. When William was 2, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she felt confident rather than afraid, knowing what to expect and trusting in her own strength. Their second son, whom they named Peter after Marcus's father, arrived on a summer evening with far less difficulty than William's birth, and Marcus joked that clearly their children were as adapted to mountain life as their parents. 2 years after Peter came a daughter, whom Penelope insisted on naming Emily for Marcus's first wife. He cried when she told him, overwhelmed that she would honor his loss in such a way. She would have liked you, he told Penelope as he held their tiny daughter. Emily would have thought you were wonderful. I wish I could have known her, Penelope said honestly, but I am grateful that her loss eventually led you to me, even though I would never wish such pain on anyone. As the children grew, the cabin grew too. Marcus built an addition with 2 small sleeping rooms for the boys to share, and for Emily to have when she was older. He expanded the garden, built a larger shed for the animals, and created a workshop where he crafted furniture and tools during the long winter months. Penelope taught the children to read and write using her precious books, started her own small library with volumes Marcus brought back from his increasingly rare trips to Grass Valley, and made sure they understood the value of education even in their isolated home. The Washoe became like extended family, their children playing with Penelope and Marcus's children, sharing knowledge and traditions that enriched all their lives. William and Peter learned to speak the Washoe language as fluently as English, and Emily's first words were a mixture of both. Running Deer, growing old but still sharp and wise, declared that Penelope had become a true daughter of the mountains, and Morning Light became as close as a sister. When William was 8, Peter 6, and Emily 4, they made their first trip as a family down to Grass Valley. It had been nearly a decade since Penelope had left, and she was curious to see how the town had changed, and whether anyone would even remember her. Mrs. Henderson was still running her boarding house, though she was grayer and moved slower than Penelope remembered. The old woman's face lit up when she saw Penelope walking down Main Street with her family in tow, and she came hurrying out to embrace her former boarder. "Penelope Carter, or Hayes, I should say, look at you, and these beautiful children. Oh, you look so happy, dear girl, so healthy and content." "I am," Penelope said, laughing as her children hid shyly behind her skirts. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. And this must be the mountain man who stole you away. Marcus, is it? Well, you have taken good care of our Penelope, I can see that. She glows with it." They spent 3 days in Grass Valley, and Penelope felt like a curiosity on display. Everyone wanted to see the old maid who had run off to the mountains, to judge whether she had made a terrible mistake or a brilliant choice. But Penelope stood tall and proud beside her husband, introduced her bright-eyed children with obvious love, and made it clear that she had not a single regret. Martha Simmons, the woman who had predicted Penelope would die alone and forgotten, approached her in the general store with a pinched expression. "Well, Penelope, I see you have made quite a life for yourself in those mountains, though I am sure it must be terribly hard, so isolated and primitive." "It is hard sometimes," Penelope agreed pleasantly, "but it is also beautiful and fulfilling in ways I never expected. I have a husband who adores me, children who bring me joy every day, and a community of friends who have become family. I could not ask for more." "Yes, well," Martha sniffed. "I suppose if you are content with such a rough existence, that is your choice. My daughters all married well and have fine homes in proper towns. And I am sure they are very happy," Penelope said with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Just as I am happy with my choice." Different paths for different people, is it not? On their last evening in Grass Valley, as they prepared to head back up the mountain the next morning, Penelope stood at the window of their hotel room and looked out at the town. Marcus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Any part of you that wishes you had stayed here?" Penelope leaned back against his solid warmth, watching the lamplights flicker in the windows below. "Not a single one," she said. "This was where my story began, but the mountains are where I truly came alive, where we built something real and lasting. I am grateful for what this town taught me, but I am even more grateful that I was brave enough to leave it behind." "We should head home tomorrow," Marcus murmured. "The mountains are calling." "Yes," Penelope agreed. "Let us go home." The journey back up the mountain felt like returning to themselves after a brief visit to a foreign land. The children chattered excitedly about the strange town and all the people. But Penelope could see they were also eager to return to the familiar comfort of the cabin, and the meadow and the wild places they knew so well. As they crested the final ridge and the valley spread out before them, Penelope felt her heart swell with recognition and joy. There was the cabin, sturdy and welcoming, with smoke already rising from the chimney where they had left a low fire burning. There was the creek sparkling in the afternoon sun, and the meadow with its carpet of late summer wildflowers, and the mountains rising behind it, all in layers of magnificent blue and purple. "We are home," Emily said with satisfaction, echoing Penelope's own thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart," Penelope agreed. "We are home." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of the seasons and the growth of their family. William grew tall and strong like his father, learning to hunt and trap and move through the mountains with the silent grace of a predator. Peter developed a gift for working with wood and metal, crafting beautiful and useful items in the workshop Marcus had built. Emily proved to be whip-smart and curious about everything, devouring every book they owned and constantly begging her mother for more. When Penelope was 39, she gave birth to their fourth and final child, another son they named James. Marcus was 43 by then, his dark hair now liberally streaked with silver, and his face weathered by years of mountain sun and wind, but still strong and vital. He took the news of another baby with his characteristic joy, and immediately began planning an even larger addition to the cabin. "We are going to need more room," he said, already sketching plans on the precious paper they used sparingly. "James will need his own space eventually, and Emily should not have to share with her brothers forever. We are going to end up with a house the size of a hotel," Penelope teased, but she was secretly pleased. This cabin, this home they had built together, represented everything they had created from nothing but love and determination and hard work. By the time James was 5, Running Deer had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and Penelope and Marcus mourned him as they would have mourned a beloved father. His granddaughter Morning Light had taken over as the elder of her family group, and her own children and grandchildren continued the traditions of friendship between their two families. William, now 17, had grown into a man who moved as comfortably in both the White and Washoe worlds, speaking both languages fluently and respected by both communities. He had fallen in love with one of Morning Light's granddaughters, a bright-eyed girl named Fawn, and they talked of marriage. Penelope watched her eldest son court, the girl with the same quiet intensity Marcus had shown her all those years ago, and her heart was full knowing that William had learned what real love looked like. Peter, at 15, had developed into a master craftsman, whose work was sought after even in the distant towns of the valley. He talked of perhaps spending a season down in Grass Valley or Sacramento, learning from other craftsmen and expanding his skills, though he always made it clear he would return to the mountains. This was his home, and nothing would change that. Emily, at 13, was already taller than her mother and showed signs of growing into a beauty, though she was more interested in books and learning than in boys. She had announced her intention to become a teacher like her grandmother had been, and Penelope spent hours working with her, teaching her everything she knew and encouraging her sharp mind. And little James, still just a boy, was the surprise joy of their later years. He had Marcus's blue-gray eyes and Penelope's quick mind, and he followed his father everywhere, soaking up knowledge about the mountains and the animals like a sponge. One evening in late summer, with all the children occupied with their own activities, Marcus took Penelope's hand and led her up to a high meadow they had discovered years ago. It was their special place, somewhere they went when they needed to remember who they were beyond being parents and providers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in impossible shades of pink and orange and purple, and the whole world seemed to glow with golden light. They sat on their favorite rock, Marcus's arm around Penelope and her head on his shoulder, and looked out over the valleys and peaks that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if I had not asked you to come up here with me?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet and reflective. "If you had stayed in Grass Valley and eventually married someone else?" Penelope considered the question seriously, as she always did when Marcus asked her something. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only in the way you wonder about paths not taken. I might have been comfortable, I might have been content, but I would never have been this happy, this fulfilled, this entirely myself. You gave me that, Marcus. You saw who I really was and loved me for it, and you gave me the freedom to become even more than I knew I could be." "You did the same for me," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was dying up here alone, even if I did not know it. You brought me back to life, gave me a reason to hope again, to dream again, to believe that joy was still possible. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent, and the stars began to appear, first a few scattered points of light, and then a vast cascade of brilliance that never ceased to take Penelope's breath away. She thought about the girl she had been in Grass Valley, so lost and lonely and convinced her life was over before it had really begun. She thought about the whispers and the pity, about Martha Simmons predicting she would die an old maid alone, about how close she had come to accepting that fate. And then she thought about the moment she had looked across a dusty street and met a pair of storm-cloud eyes, and how everything had changed in that instant. How one brave choice, one wild leap of faith had led to all of this. A home in the mountains, a husband she loved more with each passing year, children who were growing into remarkable people, a community of friends who had become family, and a life rich with purpose and meaning and joy. "I am so glad you asked me," she said softly. "I am so glad I said yes. I am so glad we took that chance before the season could change." Marcus tightened his arm around her, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to take a chance on a mountain man with nothing to offer but a hard life and a whole lot of love." "You offered me everything," Penelope corrected, as she always did when he talked that way. "You offered me you, and that was more than enough." They made their way back down to the cabin as full dark settled over the mountains, their path lit by starlight and long familiarity. Through the windows they could see lamplight and movement, hear the sounds of their children's voices raised in conversation and laughter. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the whole scene looked like something from a painting, warm and welcoming and full of life. Marcus paused on the porch, looking at Penelope in the light spilling from the windows. His hair was more silver than brown now, his face lined with years and weather, but his eyes still held that same intensity and warmth that had captivated her from the very beginning. "I love you," he said simply. "More than words can say. More than I thought it was possible to love another person." Penelope reached up to cup his weathered cheek, feeling the familiar roughness of his evening stubble. "And I love you, every single day more than the day before. You are my home, Marcus Hayes. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." They kissed then, long and sweet and deep, a kiss that held all the history and love and commitment of their years together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and Marcus took her hand to lead her inside to their family and their life. The years continued to unfold, each bringing its own joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. William married his fawn in a beautiful ceremony that blended Washoe and white traditions, and they built their own cabin in a valley near Marcus and Penelope's, close enough to visit easily but far enough to establish their own independence. Their first child, a daughter they named Penelope in honor of her grandmother, arrived within a year, and Penelope found that being a grandmother brought its own special kind of joy. Peter did eventually spend a season in Sacramento learning from master craftsmen, but true to his word, he returned to the mountains and set up his own workshop. He never married, seeming content with his craft and his family, though Penelope sometimes caught a wistful look in his eyes when he watched William with Fawn. Emily grew into a formidable woman, tall and strong-minded like her mother, and she did indeed become a teacher. She split her time between the mountain communities and the valley towns, bringing education to children who might otherwise have none. She married at 25 to a quiet, scholarly man who supported her work and loved her fierce independence, and together they established a small school that served families in the remote areas. And James, their surprise late-in-life child, grew into a bridge between worlds. He had his father's love of the mountains and his mother's intellectual curiosity, his older brother's skills and his sister's passion for teaching. He talked of becoming a guide, leading people who wanted to experience the wilderness safely through the mountains, and both Marcus and Penelope thought it was a perfect fit for his talents and temperament. Marcus and Penelope themselves aged gracefully, their love deepening and maturing like fine wine. They still took their walks to the high meadow when they could, though the climb grew harder as the years accumulated. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set behind the peaks. They still made love with the passion and tenderness of newlyweds, though perhaps not quite as frequently as in their younger days. When Penelope was 53 and Marcus 57, they made what would be their final trip down to Grass Valley. The town had changed significantly, with more people and more buildings and even a railroad connection now. Mrs. Henderson had passed away several years before, and the boarding house had been converted into a hotel. Many of the people Penelope had known were gone or moved away, and the younger generation did not remember the old maid who had run off with a mountain man before the season could change. But standing on Main Street, looking at the place where her old life had ended and her new one had begun, Penelope felt only gratitude. This town had been the crucible that had forged her into someone strong enough to take that leap of faith. The loneliness and the pity and the whispers had all been part of what had made her ready to say yes when Marcus Hayes had offered her a wild, impossible chance at happiness. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked, his hand finding hers as it always did. "Always," Penelope said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They lived for many more years in their mountain home, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and the ever-growing community of friends who had become family. Marcus remained strong and vital well into his 60s, though he finally agreed to let the younger men do the more strenuous hunting and trapping while he focused on teaching the next generation. Penelope's hair turned silver and her hands grew gnarled with age, but her mind stayed sharp and her spirit remained indomitable. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a feast that lasted 2 days and included both Washoe and white traditions. Looking around at all the faces, all the lives that had sprung from that one brave choice made decades ago, Penelope felt overwhelmed with the richness of the legacy they had created. 30 years, Marcus marveled as they sat together watching the celebration continue around them. "Feels like both forever and no time at all." "The best 30 years of my life," Penelope said firmly. "Every single day, even the hard ones, I've been grateful that you saw me that day in Grass Valley, that you were brave enough to ask and I was brave enough to say yes." "We were both brave," Marcus said, pulling her close. "We took a chance on each other when the safe choice would have been to walk away, and look what we built from that chance." Penelope looked out at their assembled family, at William and Fawn with their 3 children, at Peter with his nephew perched on his knee, at Emily with her husband and their twin boys, at James now, a young man of 21 with his whole life ahead of him. She looked at Morning Light's family mixed in with her own, at the younger generation who barely distinguished between Washoe and white because they had grown up together in these mountains. "We built a world," she said softly. "A whole world where love matters more than convention, where people are judged by their character and not their circumstances, where different ways of living can exist side by side in respect and friendship." "That is not a bad legacy, Marcus Hayes." "No," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "That is a fine legacy indeed." They continued to celebrate late into the night, and when everyone had finally bedded down in the expanded cabin, and in tents scattered around the meadow, Marcus and Penelope walked one last time up to their high meadow. It was harder now, their joints protesting the climb, but they took their time and helped each other over the rough spots. At the top, they sat on their rock and looked out over the star-washed landscape they knew so well. The same peaks and valleys, the same stars wheeling overhead, the same sense of peace and rightness that this place had always given them. "When I die," Marcus said quietly, "I want to be buried up here, in these mountains that gave me back my life." "When we die," Penelope corrected gently. "We came here together, we have lived here together, and we will rest here together. But not for a long time yet, I hope. I am not ready to leave this beautiful world, and I am certainly not ready to leave you." "Nor I you," Marcus said. "We still have years ahead of us. Grandchildren to watch grow up, great-grandchildren to meet, sunsets to watch and seasons to celebrate." "Yes," Penelope agreed. "We do." And they did. They had 5 more good years together, years filled with love and family and the quiet contentment that comes from a life well lived. Marcus passed first, in his sleep one winter night with Penelope curled against his side where she had slept for 35 years. He simply did not wake up, gone peacefully to whatever lay beyond without pain or suffering. Penelope grieved, of course, deep and hard and honest. But she did not break. She had their children and grandchildren around her, the community they had built, the memories of a love that had sustained her for more than 3 decades. She continued to live in the cabin they had shared, continued to welcome family and friends, continued to walk up to the high meadow when she could to talk to Marcus, as if he were still sitting beside her on their rock. She lived for 3 more years after Marcus's death, and in that time, she finished writing down their story in a journal she had kept throughout their marriage. She wanted their descendants to know how it had begun, how a lonely woman and a lonely man had found each other in a dusty California town and built something beautiful from nothing but courage and love. When her own time came, Penelope died as peacefully as Marcus had, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, in the home she had made in the mountains. They buried her beside Marcus in the high meadow, just as she had wished, under a simple stone marker that William carved with the words, "Here lie Marcus and Penelope Hayes, who loved each other, their family, and these mountains." They built a legacy of courage and showed us all that it is never too late to choose love over fear. Years later, decades later, their story became a legend in the region. The old maid who had been told she would die alone, and the mountain man who had proposed before the season could change, and the beautiful life they had built together against all odds. Their descendants continued to live in and around the mountains, carrying forward the values of love and respect and courage that Marcus and Penelope had modeled. And on clear nights, when the stars were bright and the wind whispered through the pines, people said you could sometimes see 2 figures sitting together on a rock in the high meadow, holding hands and watching the sunset, still together as they had always been, still choosing each other across all the boundaries of time and mortality. Because love like theirs, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership and the courage to take a chance on each other, did not end with death. It transformed, becoming something eternal, a light that continued to shine for generations yet to come. The town of Grass Valley had been wrong about Penelope Carter. She had not died an old maid, alone and forgotten. She had died Penelope Hayes, beloved wife and mother and grandmother, surrounded by the vast family she and Marcus had created. In the home they had built together in the mountains she had learned to love as much as she loved him. And if that was not a happy ending, then nothing ever could be.